Welcome to Life Stories, where we share inspiring tales that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Today's story is about Dr. Elijah Carter, a dedicated doctor who faced humiliation at a restaurant, only to transform that moment into a powerful message of forgiveness and community. Through his grace and resilience, Dr. Carter turned pain into purpose, bringing people together in ways no one could have imagined. If you love heartwarming and thought-provoking stories, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories. Let's dive in and start today's journey of hope and transformation. It was the kind of exhaustion that seeped into your bones and left you feeling hollow, yet oddly fulfilled. Dr. Elijah Carter leaned against the counter of the nurses' station at Mercy General Hospital, the weight of a 16-hour shift pressing down on him. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the corridors, where the echoes of hurried footsteps and distant monitors formed a familiar symphony. Elijah rubbed his temples, his white coat crumpled and marked with the subtle traces of his long-day ink stains from a pen, faint smudges of antiseptic, and the unmistakable crease of relentless work. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past noon. His stomach grumbled softly, reminding him that it had been hours, maybe more, since he'd eaten anything beyond a granola bar hastily grabbed between rounds. Elijah sighed, signed the final patient chart in front of him, and placed it neatly on the stack. "You've earned a good meal, Elijah," he muttered to himself, his voice low and gravelly after hours of giving instructions and offering reassurances. The thought of going home to a cold sandwich and collapsing on his couch seemed unappealing. Even to his tired body, today felt like it called for something different, something indulgent. He needed to step out of the hospital's walls, away from the beeping monitors and the weight of life and death decisions. As he stepped out into the brisk air, the sun blinded him momentarily. The sky was clear, a rare gift in the middle of a bustling city. Elijah took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. For a moment, he stood still, allowing the sunlight to touch his face and pull him out of the fog of fatigue. It didn't take him long to decide on the Blue Ivy Bistro. The upscale restaurant was just a few blocks away, and though it was a place he rarely visited, today seemed like the right occasion. The idea of sitting in a quiet corner, enjoying a well-cooked meal, felt like a small luxury he could afford after the relentless pace of his day. As Elijah walked through the city streets, his scrubs hidden under his coat, he caught snippets of conversations and glimpses of lives unfolding around him. A young woman haggled with a vendor at a flower stand. Two children laughed as they chased each other down the sidewalk. The world seemed to pulse with energy and life, a stark contrast to the stillness he often encountered in hospital rooms. By the time he reached the Blue Ivy Bistro, the streets were buzzing with the lunch crowd. Elijah hesitated for a moment outside the restaurant's elegant glass doors, aware of his appearance. His coat wasn't pristine, and his face bore the marks of a man who had barely slept. But he pushed the thought aside. He wasn't there to impress anyone, he was there to find a moment of peace. "Table for one," the host asked as Elijah stepped inside. The man's voice was polite, but Elijah noticed the subtle glance at his attire, the faint narrowing of his eyes. Elijah nodded and smiled warmly, following him to a cozy corner table near the window. As he sank into the plush chair, Elijah allowed himself to relax for the first time in hours. The soft lighting of the restaurant, paired with the faint strains of classical music playing in the background, felt soothing. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the peaceful atmosphere wash over him. When he opened them again, he noticed the pristine white tablecloth before him, the gleam of polished silverware, and the fresh flowers arranged in a delicate vase. It was a stark contrast to the fluorescent lights and sterile surfaces of the hospital. A waiter approached, his apron neatly tied, and offered a menu. "Just water for now, please," Elijah said, his voice still carrying the weight of his fatigue. He scanned the menu quickly, the elegant descriptions of dishes blending together. He wasn't there for a culinary adventure, just something simple and satisfying. "I'll have the grilled salmon," he said after a moment. As the waiter walked away, Elijah became aware of his surroundings. A couple at the table to his left whispered to each other, their eyes darting in his direction. Across the room, a group of diners glanced at him briefly before returning to their conversation. It wasn't overt, but Elijah could feel it, a faint, buzzing awareness of his presence that lingered in the air. He looked down at his hands, noticing the faint smudges of ink and the way his fingers trembled slightly from exhaustion. He chuckled softly to himself, imagining how out of place he must have seemed in this refined setting. But he brushed the thought aside. He was just a man looking for a meal, no different from anyone else in the room. The waiter returned with his water and placed it carefully on the table. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something from the bar menu?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with a hint of hesitation. Elijah smiled faintly. "I'm quite happy with the regular menu. Thank you." As the waiter left, Elijah leaned back in his chair and let his eyes wander out the window. The world outside continued at its usual pace, indifferent to the lives unfolding within the restaurant's walls. He thought about the patients he had left at the hospital, the young boy who had clung to his hand in fear before surgery, the elderly woman whose smile had been a balm for his tired spirit. Each one had left a mark on him, and in turn, he had left a mark on them. This moment, he reminded himself, was about recharging. He couldn't help anyone if he didn't take care of himself first. But even as he tried to relax, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers and glances around him carried a weight he couldn't ignore. And so, Elijah waited, unaware that his quiet moment of self-care was about to be disrupted in a way he never could have imagined. The restaurant bustled with activity, a mix of polished elegance and the controlled chaos of a busy lunch hour. Dr. Elijah Carter, though seated quietly in the corner, felt as though he was under a spotlight. The faint whispers from the neighboring tables were hard to miss, though he pretended not to notice. The glances, some curious, others pointed, were harder to ignore. Elijah shifted slightly in his seat, trying to brush off the unease creeping into his otherwise calm demeanor. The truth was, Elijah had spent so much of his life in scrubs that he barely noticed them anymore. They were his armor in the hospital, a symbol of trust and competence. But here, in the polished and refined setting of the Blue Ivy Bistro, they felt out of place. His rumpled coat and slightly worn shoes only added to the contrast. He glanced around and saw diners in neatly pressed suits, tailored dresses, and sparkling accessories. Their polished appearances only underscored the difference, making him feel, for the first time in a long while, self-conscious. Behind the host stand, the restaurant manager, William Thompson, stood observing the room, a tall man with sharp features and a neatly pressed suit. William had an eye for detail. He prided himself on maintaining the Blue Ivy's reputation as one of the city's finest establishments. His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Elijah. Something about the man caught his attention, the scrubs peeking out from under the coat, the slightly disheveled appearance, and the credit card Elijah had handed to the waiter earlier. "Is everything all right with table 6? William asked the hostess, keeping his voice low but firm. His eyes remained fixed on Elijah's table. The hostess glanced over and hesitated before responding. "He hasn't caused any trouble," she said cautiously. "He ordered his meal, paid ahead, and has been keeping to himself." William frowned. "Doesn't it seem unusual? A man walks into a fine dining establishment wearing scrubs, looking like he just walked out of a shift, and hands over his credit card before his meal even arrives." The hostess shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, sir. Maybe he's a doctor." William raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched on his face. "Or maybe it's a costume. And that credit card. It wouldn't be the first time someone's tried to pull a stunt in a place like this." He paused, his expression darkening. "Keep an eye on him." As the hostess nodded reluctantly, William's mind churned. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. His thoughts spiraled, fueled by the biases he barely recognized within himself. He had seen enough in his years managing high-end establishments to know that not everyone who walked through the door belonged there, or so he thought. Minutes passed, and William's suspicions grew. The way Elijah Saturday seemingly detached from the world around him only deepened his doubts. With a glance toward the waiter returning from Elijah's table, William stepped forward. "Excuse me," William said, intercepting the young man. "Did everything seem in order with table 6? The waiter hesitated, clearly taken aback by the question. "Yes, sir." His polite, quiet, and tired. "I think he prepaid for his meal, just as he said he would." William's jaw tightened. "It's not just about politeness," he said, his voice firm. "There's a certain standard we maintain here. We can't afford to overlook potential issues." The waiter looked puzzled but nodded. "Understood, sir." Unconvinced, William retreated to his office, his suspicions hardening into resolve. He pulled out his phone and hesitated for only a moment before dialing the local police station. His fingers gripped the phone tightly as he explained his concerns, his voice low but insistent. "I'd like to report a potential case of credit card fraud," he said. "The man is seated at my restaurant right now. He's acting suspicious." After describing Elijah's appearance and his supposed concerns, William ended the call and leaned back in his chair. He told himself he was doing the right thing, protecting the integrity of his establishment. But deep down, a small voice whispered doubts, a voice he quickly silenced. Out in the dining room, Elijah waited patiently for his meal, oblivious to the wheels that had been set in motion. His mind wandered back to the hospital, to the patients he had treated and the challenges he had faced over the past 16 hours. The exhaustion still lingered, but he was looking forward to the meal ahead, a small reward for his efforts. What he didn't know was that, in a matter of moments, his peaceful lunch would be interrupted in a way he could never have anticipated. The suspicion that had taken root in William's mind was about to disrupt not just Elijah's meal, but the very atmosphere of the restaurant itself. The soft ambience of the Blue Ivy Bistro, the gentle clinking of silverware and the low murmur of conversations was shattered as the restaurant's front doors swung open. 2 uniformed police officers strode in, their presence immediately drawing the attention of diners. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and heads turned toward the sudden intrusion. Elijah, seated in his corner, barely noticed the shift at first. His focus was on the light streaming through the windows and the first sip of water that offered a moment of relief after his long shift. The officers, a tall, imposing man named Officer Johnson and his partner, Officer Martinez, exchanged brief words with the hostess. She pointed discreetly toward Elijah's table, her face pale with unease. The officers nodded and began making their way across the dining room, their heavy boots thudding softly against the polished hardwood floor. The air grew thick with tension as patrons whispered among themselves, some craning their necks to get a better look. It wasn't until Officer Johnson's shadow fell across his table that Elijah noticed their presence. He glanced up, his face reflecting a mixture of confusion and fatigue. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Sir," Officer Johnson began, his tone firm but professional, "we've received a report of potential credit card fraud. May we see some identification?" Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned by the accusation. He set his water glass down carefully, his movements deliberate. "Of course," he said evenly, reaching into the pocket of his coat. He produced his wallet and handed over his driver's license, along with his hospital ID. "I'm Dr. Elijah Carter. I work at St. Vincent's Medical Center, just a few blocks from here." Officer Martinez examined the IDs, her expression unreadable. Meanwhile, the restaurant manager, William, lingered nearby, his face a mask of concern and doubt. Elijah glanced in his direction, And understanding began to dawn. The suspicion. The whispers. The sudden arrival of the police, it all pointed back to William. "This is your credit card, sir?" Officer Johnson asked, holding up the card the waiter had taken earlier. "Yes, it is," Elijah replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge of frustration. "I used it to pay for my meal before it was served. I wasn't aware that would be considered unusual." The officers exchanged a look. "Do you have any additional proof of your identity?" Officer Martinez asked. "Perhaps something that confirms your employment at the hospital?" Elijah took a slow breath, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Diners watched the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. He reached for his stethoscope, which was tucked into his coat pocket, and placed it on the table alongside his hospital ID. "I'm not sure how much more proof you need," he said, his voice remaining calm despite the humiliation tightening his chest. But the officers weren't satisfied. They stepped aside to make a call to the hospital, their voices low but urgent. Meanwhile, Elijah sat still, his meal untouched, the whispers around him growing louder. He could hear fragments of conversations, the couple at the next table murmuring about how he didn't look like a doctor, a man across the room commenting on how you can never be too careful these days. Elijah's stomach churned. He had spent his life saving others, working tirelessly to ensure the well-being of his patients. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal in front of strangers, his dignity stripped away by the biases of those around him. When Officer Martinez returned, her expression had softened slightly. "We've confirmed your identity with the hospital," she said. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Elijah's jaw tightened. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "Or an assumption?" Before either officer could respond, William stepped forward, wringing his hands. "Dr. Carter, I don't know what to say. I assumed." "You assumed wrong," Elijah interrupted, his exhaustion giving way to a simmering anger. He stood, his tall frame commanding the room. "You assumed because of how I look, how I'm dressed, that I didn't belong here." The room fell silent, the weight of Elijah's words hanging heavy in the air. The officers muttered apologies, their discomfort evident, and William stammered out an offer to cover Elijah's meal. But the damage was done. Elijah nodded curtly, gathered his belongings, and left the restaurant, his appetite lost. As he stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, the humiliation of the encounter hit him fully. Yet, beneath the hurt, a resolve began to form. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but it would be the last time he allowed it to go unanswered. Elijah Carter had spent his life helping others, and now, he resolved, he would use this experience to spark something bigger, something that could challenge the biases and assumptions that had tainted his quiet lunch. Elijah Carter walked briskly down the city street, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The afternoon sun was warm against his back, but he felt cold inside. The scene at the Blue Ivy Bistro replayed in his mind like a bad dream, being confronted by officers, the skeptical gazes of the diners, the restaurant manager's excuses. Every moment stung, a reminder of how deeply ingrained biases could be. Yet, as much as the experience hurt, Elijah's thoughts weren't on himself alone. He couldn't stop thinking about how often similar situations must happen to others, people without his credentials or calm demeanor to diffuse the situation. He was lost in thought when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Dr. Carter speaking," he said, his voice still carrying traces of the day's tension. "Dr. Carter, this is William." The manager from the Blue Ivy Bistro came the hesitant reply. Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. I wanted to call and apologize again. There's no excuse for what happened today." Elijah took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. "William, what happened today wasn't just a mistake. It was a result of an assumption you made about me based on my appearance. Do you understand that? There was a pause on the other end of the line before William spoke again. His voice barely above a whisper. I do. Dr. Carter. And I know I can't undo the harm I caused. But I want to make it right. Somehow. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Skeptical. And how exactly do you plan to do that? I don't know yet. William admitted. But I'd like to meet with you to discuss it. If you'd be willing. Elijah considered the offer. Part of him wanted to brush William off, to let him stew in his guilt. But another part of him, the part that had dedicated his life to helping others, saw an opportunity. All right, he said finally. Let's talk. The following day, Elijah found himself back at the Blue Ivy Bistro. This time, the atmosphere felt different. The staff seemed subdued, avoiding his gaze as he entered. William greeted him at the door, his face etched with remorse. He led Elijah to a quiet table near the back, where they sat down to talk. I've been thinking about what happened. William began, his hands clasped tightly on the table, and about how this restaurant, a place that's supposed to welcome everyone, became the site of such an awful experience for you. I want to do better, Dr. Carter. But I need your help. Elijah regarded him carefully, searching for sincerity in his words. What exactly are you proposing? A community event, William said, his voice gaining confidence. Something that shows this restaurant stands for inclusivity. I don't know exactly what yet. But maybe you do. Elijah leaned back in his chair, the beginnings of an idea forming in his mind. What if we held a free health clinic here, he suggested. This space could be transformed into something that benefits the community, a place where people from all walks of life feel welcomed and cared for. William's eyes widened. A health clinic. Here. That's an incredible idea. Elijah nodded, his confidence growing. It would be a chance to not just make amends but to make a real difference. We could offer basic medical services, health screenings, and information sessions. And maybe, just maybe, we could use this event to start conversations about bias and how it affects people. William sat silently for a moment, clearly overwhelmed. Then he extended his hand across the table. Let's do it, he said firmly. As Elijah shook his hand, he felt a flicker of hope. What had started as a moment of humiliation was now becoming an opportunity for transformation. Together, he and William began sketching out the details of the event, brainstorming ways to involve the community and make the clinic a success. For Elijah, this wasn't just about a single event. It was about creating a ripple effect, a movement that could challenge biases and build bridges. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but as he looked at William, he realized they both had something to prove. And together, they could turn this moment of pain into something truly powerful. Over the next few days, Elijah Carter threw himself into planning the community health clinic. The Blue Ivy Bistro, with its sleek modern interior and central location, would serve as the perfect venue. The transformation from an upscale dining space into a makeshift medical facility seemed symbolic, turning a place of exclusion into one of inclusion and care. Elijah reached out to colleagues at the hospital, explaining the situation and his vision for the clinic. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Nurses, doctors, and medical assistants eagerly volunteered their time. Count me in, said Sarah Mitchell, one of Elijah's closest colleagues. It's about time we had something like this in our community. Supplies were another challenge. Elijah contacted local pharmaceutical companies, medical suppliers, and even nearby clinics for donations. The generosity was humbling: stethoscopes, blood pressure monitors, bandages, and even boxes of medications began to arrive. Each contribution felt like a step toward healing, not just for himself, but for the entire community. As plans progressed, William, the restaurant manager, became fully invested in the project. He rallied his staff, who initially seemed unsure but soon threw themselves into the effort. Tables and chairs were rearranged to create consultation spaces. The kitchen staff volunteered to provide refreshments for attendees. The restaurant owner, who had been briefed on the situation, pledged financial support and personally thanked Elijah for turning the incident into a positive force. One afternoon, as Elijah walked into the bistro to finalize the layout, he noticed a familiar face. Officer Johnson, one of the policemen from the incident, stood near the entrance, his hat in his hands. His partner, Officer Martinez, was with him, her expression equally serious. "Dr. Carter," Johnson began, his voice heavy with regret. "We heard about the clinic. We'd like to help, if you'll have us." Elijah's first instinct was to brush them off, to tell them their help wasn't needed. But he paused, taking a deep breath. This clinic was about building bridges, not walls. "If you're serious about helping, we could use crowd control and support with organizing attendees," he said. "This isn't just a clinic, it's about the community coming together." Relief washed over their faces. "Thank you," Martinez said. "We want to make amends, and this feels like a way to start." The day of the clinic arrived quickly. As Elijah approached the restaurant that morning, he felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. The line outside the Blue Ivy Bistro stretched down the block, families with children, elderly couples, and individuals from all walks of life had come seeking care. Elijah's heart swelled with both pride and responsibility. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with activity. Medical stations were set up at neatly spaced tables, each staffed by a doctor or nurse. Volunteers guided patients to their appointments, while William and his staff ensured everything ran smoothly. Elijah caught a glimpse of Officer Johnson helping an elderly man with a walker, and Officer Martinez chatting warmly with a family. As the first patient, a young mother holding a toddler, stepped forward, Elijah felt the weight of the day ahead. But he also felt hope. This clinic wasn't just a response to a painful experience, it was a declaration that change was possible, that understanding and compassion could triumph over prejudice. And as the morning sunlight streamed through the restaurant's large windows, Elijah knew they were on the brink of something truly transformative. The clinic was in full swing, and the energy inside the Blue Ivy Bistro was electric. Each corner of the restaurant buzzed with activity. Nurses moved briskly between patients, checking vital signs, administering vaccinations, and providing advice on managing chronic conditions. Doctors sat at tables turned into consultation stations, engaging deeply with individuals who might not have seen a physician in years. The hum of conversation filled the air, punctuated by occasional laughter or the grateful words of a patient. Elijah Carter stood near the main entrance, welcoming attendees and ensuring that everything was running smoothly. A line still stretched outside the bistro, but no one seemed impatient. Inside, there was a palpable sense of unity. People of all ages, races, and backgrounds mingled. For many, this was more than a clinic, it was a symbol of hope and renewal. As Elijah helped guide a young family to one of the stations, his eyes landed on Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez, both in casual attire. Mingling among the crowd, they were actively assisting where needed, from directing patients to helping distribute bottled water. Johnson was crouched beside an elderly woman in a wheelchair, ensuring she was comfortable while she waited her turn. Martinez helped a teenage boy fill out his intake form, her calm demeanor putting him at ease. Elijah watched them for a moment, feeling a flicker of something unexpected, pride. It was clear they had taken the opportunity to contribute seriously, though their earlier actions had been driven by bias. Their presence today felt sincere, a step toward redemption. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Dr. Carter?" He turned to see a middle-aged woman holding a sleeping toddler. "I just wanted to thank you for doing this," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "My son hasn't been feeling well, but we haven't been able to see a doctor. This This means everything to us." Her gratitude touched Elijah deeply. "I'm glad we could help," he replied, smiling warmly. "Your son is in good hands." Throughout the day, moments like this repeated again and again. An elderly man shook Elijah's hand firmly, thanking him for organizing the event. A teenager who had been struggling with asthma left with free medication and a renewed sense of hope. A single father, overwhelmed with emotion, shared how the clinic had lifted a weight off his shoulders. The restaurant staff also seemed transformed by the day's events. William, the manager, worked tirelessly, coordinating with volunteers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. The staff, who had once been wary of Elijah's presence in their restaurant, now moved with purpose, serving refreshments with genuine smiles. Their demeanor reflected a collective understanding of the importance of the event and the healing it represented. Toward the afternoon, Elijah spotted William standing near the kitchen, watching the scene unfold. When their eyes met, William approached hesitantly. "Dr. Carter," he began, "I need to say something." Elijah nodded. "Waiting. I was wrong," William said, his voice low but resolute. "About everything. About you. About how I handled that day. I can't tell you how sorry I am." Elijah looked at him for a moment, seeing the genuine remorse in his expression. "Thank you, William," he said. "What matters now is what we do moving forward. And today is a good start." As the day wore on, the event became more than just a clinic, it became a celebration of resilience and community. Strangers shared stories over cups of coffee, finding common ground where none had existed before. Laughter mingled with the soft hum of medical activity, creating an atmosphere of warmth and connection. By the time the last patient was seen, the Blue Ivy Bistro had become a beacon of transformation. What had started as a painful moment of prejudice had blossomed into a day of healing and unity. Elijah felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. They had turned hurt into hope, and the impact would ripple through the community long after the clinic ended. As the clinic came to a close, the atmosphere in the Blue Ivy Bistro was electric with the kind of energy only hope and togetherness could create. Volunteers exchanged tired smiles, and the last patients left with heartfelt gratitude etched on their faces. Elijah Carter stood by the entrance, thanking each person who walked out. Despite his exhaustion, a profound sense of accomplishment fueled him. But the day's transformation didn't end there. The next morning, William Bennett, the restaurant manager, addressed his staff. His usual brisk demeanor was softened by humility as he spoke. "Yesterday, I saw something that opened my eyes," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We were wrong to judge Dr. Carter. We were wrong to assume, to act on our biases, and to humiliate him in the way we did. But he showed us something incredible, grace." The room was silent as the staff listened. Many had been part of the initial incident and had felt the weight of their own complicity. William continued, "From now on, this restaurant will be a place of inclusivity, respect, and community. We'll learn from this and become better." William had already taken the first step toward ensuring that promise. He introduced a diversity and inclusivity trainer, who would work with the team over the next few weeks to address unconscious bias and foster a welcoming environment for all patrons. The staff, initially nervous about the process, quickly warmed to it as they shared their own experiences and reflected on the changes they wanted to see in themselves. Meanwhile, the local police department, led by Chief Angela Hayes, also took significant steps toward growth. The incident at the Blue Ivy Bistro had not gone unnoticed, and it became a rallying point for change within the department. Chief Hayes called an emergency meeting with her officers. "What happened to Dr. Carter was unacceptable," she stated firmly. "We are here to serve and protect every member of this community, without bias. It's time to look inward." Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez, who had been at the center of the controversy, stood up during the meeting. Johnson spoke first, his voice steady but reflective. "We made a mistake. A big one. And it wasn't just about one moment, it was about the assumptions we carry with us. We let those assumptions guide our actions. And it hurt an innocent man. It's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." The department introduced a comprehensive training program focusing on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and unconscious bias. Johnson and Martinez became advocates for the training, sharing their story with younger officers and urging them to examine their own behavior. "It's not easy to admit you were wrong," Johnson said during one session. "But if we don't face our mistakes, we'll never grow." The efforts extended beyond the department. Elijah partnered with the police to host community forums, fostering dialogue between officers and residents. These forums, though emotionally charged, became a space for healing and understanding. The department's willingness to engage openly and take accountability began to rebuild trust. At the heart of all these changes was Elijah Carter. Though he had been the one wronged, he became the catalyst for progress. His willingness to forgive, to lead with compassion, and to channel pain into purpose inspired not just individuals, but entire systems to do better. By the end of the month, the Blue Ivy Bistro and the local police department were already seeing the ripple effects of their efforts. William noticed a change in the way his staff interacted with patrons, a warmth and openness that hadn't been there before. Chief Hayes received letters from community members expressing renewed faith in the department's commitment to fairness. For Elijah, the transformation wasn't just about the systems, it was about the people. He saw it in the way William greeted customers with genuine care, in the way Officer Martinez listened attentively during a forum, and in the way his community came together, stronger and more united than ever. In moments of solitude, Elijah reflected on how far they had come. What had begun as a painful act of humiliation had sparked a movement of redemption, growth, and hope. He knew the work wasn't over, there would always be more to do. But for the first time in a long while, he felt The anniversary of the health clinic arrived on a crisp autumn day, with golden leaves swirling in the cool breeze outside the Blue Ivy Bistro. Inside, the restaurant was transformed once again, its elegant dining area rearranged to accommodate medical stations, a small stage, and a welcome table. Volunteers bustled about, setting up chairs and organizing supplies, while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. Elijah Carter stood near the entrance, greeting each person who walked through the doors. His calm, reassuring presence set the tone for the day. He shook hands with patients, embraced colleagues, and exchanged kind words with community members. The turnout was even larger than the year before, a testament to how far the community had come. Amidst the bustling crowd, Elijah spotted familiar faces. William Bennett, the restaurant owner, stood by the refreshment table, chatting with attendees and personally serving coffee. He had embraced his role as a community advocate, transforming his restaurant into a hub of inclusivity. Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez were also there, assisting with crowd management but taking time to interact warmly with patients. Their presence reflected a commitment to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community they served. As the morning progressed, Elijah paused to take in the scene around him. The room was alive with energy and connection. People from different walks of life, young families, elderly couples, and individuals seeking care came together, united by a shared sense of purpose. It was a stark contrast to the painful moment that had once defined this space. The highlight of the day came when William Bennett took the stage. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed the crowd, his emotions clear for all to see. "A year ago, this restaurant was the scene of an unfortunate incident," he began. "It was a moment of judgment and misunderstanding, and it caused pain to someone who deserved nothing but respect." William paused, his eyes scanning the room until they found Elijah. "Dr. Carter, you showed us something extraordinary. Instead of responding with anger, you responded with grace. You turned pain into purpose. And you've inspired all of us to do better." The crowd erupted into applause, their admiration for Elijah filling the room. Elijah smiled humbly, his heart swelling with gratitude. He hadn't sought recognition, but seeing the impact of his actions reflected in the faces of his community was a powerful moment. When the applause died down, William continued, his voice stronger now. "This health clinic is a testament to what we can achieve when we come together. And I'm proud to announce that this is just the beginning. The Blue Ivy Bistro will host this clinic annually as part of our commitment to our community." The declaration was met with another round of applause. But this time, it was accompanied by cheers and standing ovations. Elijah felt a lump in his throat as he watched the scene unfold. The restaurant, once a place of humiliation for him, had truly become a symbol of unity and healing. At the end of the event, Elijah was invited to the stage. He approached the microphone, his usual composure tinged with visible emotion. The room grew quiet, all eyes on him. "My friends," he began, his voice steady but warm, "today is about more than just a health clinic. It's about what happens when we choose to rise above pain and division. It's about forgiveness, growth, and the power of community." He paused, his gaze moving across the room. "A year ago, I stood here feeling humiliated and hurt. But today, I stand here filled with hope. Not because the pain didn't matter, but because we chose to make it matter in a way that creates change." The audience was captivated, many nodding in agreement, others wiping away tears. "We all have biases," Elijah continued, "but we also have the power to challenge them, to learn, and to grow. What we've built here today is proof of that. And I hope it inspires all of us to keep building bridges, to keep breaking down walls, and to keep coming together as a community." As he stepped back, the crowd erupted into applause, their energy a mix of pride, inspiration, and determination. Elijah's message had struck a chord, reminding everyone in the room of their capacity to effect change. Later that evening, Elijah sat at a table surrounded by the people who had been instrumental in the clinic's success. William, Officer Johnson, and Officer Martinez joined him, along with Dr. Evelyn Mitchell and other colleagues. Plates of food were passed around, and laughter filled the air. As they shared stories, Elijah reflected on how far they had come. This meal, shared among friends and allies, was a powerful symbol of reconciliation and progress. The restaurant, once a place of division, had truly become a beacon of hope. When William raised his glass to toast, his words captured the spirit of the evening perfectly. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And to the power of forgiveness." Elijah lifted his glass, a smile spreading across his face. "To our community," he added, "and to the good that can come from even the darkest moments." As the glasses clinked and the group shared a moment of unity, Elijah knew this was just the beginning. Together, they had planted the seeds of change, and he was confident they would continue to grow. As the evening settled over the transformed Blue Ivy Bistro, Dr. Elijah Carter took one last look around the room. It was no longer just a restaurant, it had become a symbol of hope, healing, and unity. The smiles of the patients, the laughter of the volunteers, and the shared stories of growth resonated deeply in his heart. What had started as a moment of humiliation had blossomed into a movement of compassion and understanding. Elijah's journey was a testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength of community. By choosing grace over anger, he had inspired lasting change not just in his own life, but in the lives of everyone who had joined this incredible journey. If you were inspired by this story, please subscribe to Life Stories. Together, let's continue sharing tales of resilience and the power of the human spirit. See you in the next story.